Once again, welcome today, whatever time zone you're in. So happy we're all here together, and deeply grateful and honored to have Philippe Cousteau join us today. Philippe and I met, maybe it was 15 years ago, Philippe?
Probably, yeah.
In San Francisco at a water and oceans gathering. And we're elated to reconnect and to share today hope, ocean of hope. We could concentrate on all the problems and all the challenges that we have, yet we feel that there's reason for optimism. And we see a future that has light and has brightness to it. And we want to focus on that aspect, the positive aspects of the oceans and our waters, and how we can be the change we wish to see in the world. So Philippe, can you share with us, as just the beginning here, about the vital role that the oceans play, and for people to understand how the oceans are the source of all the water that's just one water on our planet?
Well, first, I'd just like to say thank you to Doug Heskey for reconnecting us, Stuart, and for DPTBA as the co-host of this event, for inviting me to be a part of it. You know, this is not something that's a surprise to anybody, I'm sure. I was watching a video, an old interview with my grandfather. God, it must have been 40 years ago now. I think he was on Today Show or some such equivalent of the era. And he was talking to the reporters and talking about how the ocean is the driver of our climate, and how climate change is an issue that is becoming more and more worrisome. And he went on to explain how there is a simple thermodynamic system that the ocean drives of heat exchange, right, which drives our weather and our climate and rainfall and all those things, and bringing, you know, warm water from the tropics to the poles and vice versa through that global thermohaline current that really regulates our entire planet. And I was just struck by how 45 years ago, he was doing an interview for, again, it was Good Morning America or Today Show, something like that. And then I thought to myself, how many times I've done interviews similarly trying to explain that basic system to people just in the past year. We continue, I think, as a society of terrestrial beings to ignore, forget, whatever it may be, the role that the ocean plays truly in regulating our planet. Every drop of water comes from the ocean through evaporation or evapotranspiration. We have, of course, the regulation of our climate, and of course, what that means is our weather, and what that means is the water for the crops of our food and to drink. And so often the ocean is overlooked and forgotten as the central player in so many of the crises that we face, from biodiversity loss. Of course, we've lost more than half of the world's biodiversity in the last 40 years, excuse me, in my lifetime. Imagine that. I have two little kids, 18 months and 3.5. And I think to myself, whenever I see them, whenever I look at them, what a horrible crime we've committed to have robbed them of a world that, when I was born, has 50% less richness in life on it and biodiversity on it than when I was their age. And that's really driven by the ocean. But as you said, Stuart, I'm pleased, you know, when we reconnected, immediately began to talk about hope and opportunity, topics that I think are all too often underappreciated and are undervalued, or sentiments, I should say, by the environmental community for a multitude of reasons, but is one that we are in desperate need of. And as Becky embodied with her work with kelp, there are tremendous tools at our disposal to help solve problems and to build a better future for ourselves and for the planet. And so I know that's the trajectory that we want to go on, but I was just struck. I want to share that anecdote. I'm looking at my grandfather that like we're still having the same basic conversation we were 45 years ago.
Yeah.
And you look at, you know, the big global conferences like the COPs and et cetera, well, either the biodiversity COP in Montreal that just happened or the one in Egypt, that, you know, the ocean still takes a back seat to conversations about how we solve this big climate crisis that we're facing, this precipitous, catastrophic decline in biodiversity, when it should be front and center. So I know that's what we're here to talk about today, and I'm pleased to be a part of it.
As you say, Philippe, it's just time. We've been talking about it for, as you say, 5 decades. And maybe now people are beginning to wake up and understand that climate change is a critical issue. And there has to be action that we have to take for this, and we have to do it together. And as you said, most people don't realize that the ocean is the largest carbon sink on the planet. So do you know what percentage of the carbon is absorbed by the oceans?
Well, goodness gracious. I know that I want to say somewhere in the neighborhood of 40%. I know that the Amazon is about 25 to 28%, and the ocean far outstrips that. We've been very focused actually on the Southern Ocean in particular over the past 2 years, 3 years. I'm on the board of an organization called Antarctica 2020, and the Southern Ocean is, you know, one of the most important, if not the most important ocean on Earth, largely because of its role in carbon sequestration. Thank you. Yes, I've heard a range of numbers. Mostly, I think it leans arguably towards the higher end. In particular, when we continue to discover new systems and the way systems work, and find out the importance of things like seagrass, kelp forests, et cetera, that have for so long been overlooked, the roles of long-lived creatures like whales and sharks, et cetera, in the carbon cycle and sequestering carbon into the ocean. And we're really beginning to understand the role of things like kelp, krill in the Southern Ocean, for example, and that whole ecosystem. Interesting fact, actually, a lot of people think of the Industrial Revolution as the large-scale beginning, or I should say the beginning of a large-scale human disruption of the global carbon cycle, when in fact it predates that by a few hundred years. The largest carbon sink on Earth, single carbon sink on Earth, is in the Southern Ocean, that krill system, where krill consume phytoplankton. Phytoplankton, of course, provide the majority of oxygen on our planet, though much of that is recycled and reused into the ocean. Nevertheless, krill consume phytoplankton. That, of course, you know, the phytoplankton photosynthesizes at the surface. The krill consumes that, and either when that krill dies or when the krill poops, as it descends during the day into the deeper ocean, it is pushing that carbon that then rains down into the bottom of the ocean, where it can sit for hundreds of thousands of millions of years. And then whales eat that krill, and whale poop, it all comes back to poop. Not something you probably expected to hear me say early in the morning, but it does, work from wherever you are, maybe the afternoon or evening. And then that whale poop is rich in iron, and that iron is critical because the ocean is traditionally iron poor, and that iron then feeds the phytoplankton. And it's this feedback loop that sequesters somewhere in the neighborhood of 13 to 15 billion tons of carbon, we think, though I think that's probably a conservative estimate, in the ocean every year. When you think of a whale is the equivalent even of itself, through the carbon that it sequesters in its tissue, the equivalent of thousands of trees, one single whale. And in the 1500s, when Europe really began, and later in the 1700s, the United States got involved, particularly in the 1800s, I should say, in the United States, that really began to be a global leader in whaling. That was the beginning of a large-scale disruption of the global ocean carbon system. By removing millions of whales over those centuries from the ocean, we disrupted the system, and there is new research actually looking at this correlation between whales and phytoplankton, that as whale populations decline, instead of there being more krill, their krill populations declined, because phytoplankton populations declined because they didn't have the iron from the whale feces to feed these phytoplankton blooms, and thus the food source for the krill declined. And then that had knockoff effects, because particularly in the Southern Ocean, everything eats krill, from the penguins to the seal. You know, krill are the fundamental basis for the food chain, and that actually ripples through the entire ocean. So I just like to remind people that we've been at this for centuries longer than most people think, disrupting this carbon cycle, because of course, what did we do with these whales? Not only did we disrupt that global carbon ocean cycle, we rendered those whales into oil that we burned in lamps predominantly, and took all of that carbon and put it up into the atmosphere. So the ocean plays such a critical role and continues to do so, but one that we have hindered for many centuries. And on the flip side, one that there are technologies and abilities now for us to begin to remedy.
Yeah, let's follow that thread of the solutions and the innovations. You were talking about the ocean as a food source, and there are some innovative ideas for us to look at, quote, farming the oceans, not just from our animal species and seafood, but seaweed, kelp, and other under ocean farms. Can you talk about that? And even let's talk about you and one of the products that you've created made out of seaweed with your SeaWeed Natural products.
Sure. You know, I think one of the interesting things that exists out there that we focus on too often is sustainability. Personally, I think sustainability is a mediocre goal. And what we really need to be thinking about is how we restore these systems, and how we, in many cases, stop doing dumb things that are degrading them. I look at, for example, at kelp forests and the technology and research that's going into how we can build these kinds of kelp farms that Philippe is involved in, and that other groups are involved in. For example, working with an organization called Atlantic Sea Farms up in Maine. And what they're doing is very interesting, because it was started by a group of folks spearheaded by an extraordinary woman who is focused on building kelp farms for out-of-work lobstermen. The lobster fishery is heavily impacted in Maine. And I've heard from one of from Brianna, actually, who runs Atlantic Sea Farms, and several of the lobstermen that they work with, that their estimates are around, that the viability at the scale that exists now of the lobster fishery in Maine has maybe 15 or 20 years left. Because as the water warms, the lobster is migrating north into Canada. And so a lot of these lobstermen are looking at the end of an industry that is critical, of course, to the livelihoods of many people along the coast there. And so what Atlantic Sea Farms did is they said, listen, kelp is an extraordinary source of food. It's a superfood. There's a new research that is coming out finally, spearheaded by an organization my sister founded, actually, my sister Alexandra, that is really looking at the carbon sequestration value of kelp farms. They deacidify the water, they provide biodiverse habitat, and here along the coast of California, 80% of the kelp forest has disappeared for a variety of reasons. And so kelp can grow 2 feet in a day, and everybody talks about planting trees, and yet trees can take decades to reach real viability from a carbon perspective. And so what they're looking at is how to provide income and resources to these lobstermen to build these kelp farms. And this is an effort, as we see, in Long Island, here in California, in Alaska, British Columbia. This is happening in a lot of different places, because these are jobs that can't be outsourced. They're jobs that can provide sources of high quality food for people, help support biodiversity, help sequester carbon, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's one example of, I think, something that's really interesting that people are recognizing. Is a tool, one of many, of course, a tool in our tool belt that we need to be thinking about how we restore these systems. My other efforts that we see, though they aren't necessarily driven by an economic opportunity, But we were just in Sardinia a few months ago, working with, through my nonprofit, EarthEcho International, focused on youth global leadership in ocean and conservation and education, with young people in Sardinia restoring seagrass beds. 60% or so, I believe, of the seagrass beds in the Mediterranean have disappeared for, again, a variety of reasons, coastal pollution, overdevelopment, etc. And seagrass is also an extraordinary biodiverse habitat. It's an extraordinary carbon sink. And so we look at these systems that have been degraded over decades, if not centuries. And while sustainability is important and complex technologies to sequester, and we need to remove carbon from the atmosphere, there's no question. But there are these systems that exist that we can make effort to restore. And I think that's a oftentimes undervalued tool that we have. And so we actually started a wellness brand of topical wellness products. We're actually going to be launching another one here of supplements made from algae. As Doug mentioned, one of the primary reasons I mentioned earlier, we need to stop doing dumb stuff. We catch somewhere in the neighborhood of 1 to 2% of the global krill population in the Southern Ocean in some very critical areas like the Antarctic Peninsula, predominantly for supplements, pet food, and fish food for aquaculture. So we are disrupting one of the most important ecosystems in the ocean and on Earth for supplements, pet food, and fish food. It's the definition of stupidity. And so we're launching a vegan algae supplement, omega-3 and astaxanthin supplement later this year that is derived from algae grown in farms in New Mexico and Texas on arid land with brackish water fed by sunlight. And again, providing jobs in these communities that don't have any kind of an agricultural opportunity, these depressed communities. And so those are just two examples, I think, of this idea of looking at restorative and regenerative businesses and companies and an approach. And a lot of the companies that we work with in the water space, be it Xylem, for example, is a big partner of EarthEcho's, or we're working with Veolia, and that was just purchased, of course, Suez, that you know, there's a recognition, I think, a growing recognition that companies also need to be thinking beyond sustainability and really thinking about how they take an active role in helping to restore systems going forward. So,
systems approach and thinking is, yeah, what we need to come around to today, understanding that it's all connected. There's only one water on the planet. It's connected to everything. And of course, the water is the source. It connects to all of our food, and so many of our industrial processes are using water. Looking at that, let's talk about MPAs and the marine protected areas and how effective those solutions are.
well, you know, it's one of also the very effective tools that we have in our arsenal. And I just want to mention here a very interesting comment by Bob. Of course, the bioaccumulation of toxins is another big issue, and just an example of how we've been polluting these systems for so long. And yes, orcas are treated as toxic waste when they die in the St. Lawrence River. You know, and of course, the red tide is another example, Sandra, of kind of these systems out of balance. But there is new companies that are looking and are harvesting sargasso, excess sargasso, in order to turn it into plastic alternatives, which is very exciting, and new techniques. So again, this idea of how do we use these systems and how do we help to restore these systems, again, through not just through conservation, which is important, critical, of course, but through business. So NPAs, a big part of the work going forward, again, speaking of hope, reminds me of a story about 5 years ago. My wife Ashlan and I were filming in the Marshall Islands for a Discovery Channel Shark Week special. And we'd heard rumors that sharks around Bikini Atoll, where the United States had conducted about 23 nuclear bomb tests during the 1950s and 60s, devastating, destroying everything above and below the surface. I mean, the largest thermonuclear device we ever detonated, Castle Bravo, which had a yield of about 1,000 times stronger than the bombs we dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In fact, the yield was so powerful, it surprised the scientists themselves when they tested it for the first time. it destroyed everything above and below the surface for miles around the blast site, as you can imagine. And of course, the islands continue to have cesium in the sand and the soil, and you can't go onto the islands for much longer than 15, 20 minutes. But the ocean has dissipated, diluted that radiation so that it's safe to dive. And we'd heard rumors that somehow the shark populations were back in this area. And what was curious about that fact is that up until that point, just a few years ago, again, reminding us that we continue to know very little about the ocean, that the shark populations are reef sharks, gray reef sharks predominantly, and some of these atolls are hundreds of miles away from other atolls. And the basic assumption was always that reef sharks don't migrate. And so if there were large populations of sharks that had returned to Bikini, how and why was that happening? And so we went with some scientists to apply fin tags to these sharks to try and track them and see what was going on, and indeed just verify if that was the fact. How just 60 years later, when literally everything was destroyed, how have these sharks returned in such apparent numbers? Because if there are high populations of sharks, that means there's an entire ecosystem underneath it to support them. And I can tell you, when after multiple days on a refurbished, barely refurbished, rickety shrimp trawler from Majuro Island in the Marshalls all the way up to Bikini Atoll, passing through Ragalap and Likiap and these other islands, which continue. I mean, it's kind of surreal. You go onto these islands and there are these villages that live on these islands, and then a couple hundred yards away, there's an old, massive Japanese concrete bunker in the middle of the jungle with tanks, ruined tanks sitting around, and anti-aircraft guns dissolving into the beach, into the sand, just sitting there. It kind of blows your mind. And we made it to Bikini and put our gear on and jumped into a little Zodiac, and immediately the water was frothing with sharks coming up out of the water to see what was there, because not many people go to this area. And we were astounded when we entered the water to find 60 or 70 reef sharks swirling around us. Predominantly a curiosity. Sometimes they got a little bit close, but there were no problems. And what we found, of course, was that by attaching some of these tags, that reef sharks do indeed migrate, in some cases over 100 miles to some of these other atolls. But the basically what we realized was that this area had become a de facto marine protected area because of the radiation over the last 60 plus years. And some of the researchers that we were working with who have been studying this area were talking about, in fact, one quote always stuck in my mind where one of the researchers said, between nuclear Armageddon and people are worse. Because over 60 plus years, this ecosystem had bounced back spectacularly. And as an MPA, nature had been allowed to do what it does. We had groupers the size of German shepherds, giant clams, the coral was spectacular, massive schools of sharks. And it was something, I'll never forget, and was really impactful to the entire crew to see this. When after the worst fire and brimstone that humanity can engineer was lobbed at these islands for 20 years, 15 years, nature bounced back. And it's evidence that we see in many communities around the world, the power of marine protected areas. That is a critical tool in our tool belt to effect positive change and to allow nature to renew and restore itself. And we see it in communities like Cabo Pulmo down in Mexico, that established about 20 years ago a 70 square kilometer no-take marine reserve. Radical at the time. The community stopped fishing and became local enforcers, and now their tourism in that community is driving gains in income and opportunity that get better and better every year, versus many of those communities where every year the fish stocks and the opportunity for young people declines. And we see all over the world. And so when we think about MPAs, I really like to think of them as a super tool. And currently there's an effort that I'm sure many of you have heard of, but if you haven't, I encourage you to take a look. It's called 30 by 30. And it is a response to E.O. Wilson's essentially his challenge to the world, that in order to stave off the worst biodiversity decline that is currently happening, we need to set aside at least 30% of the ocean and at least 30% of land, ideally 50%, over the next 30% by 2030 and 50% by the middle of the century, as protected areas for nature to function as it's meant. And that is a big focus of Earth Echo and the work we do, building a global youth movement for this work and a global youth strategy, because as a friend of mine once said, if you don't have a youth strategy, you don't have a strategy at all, to achieve this goal of 30 by 30 and to affect one of the most powerful tools that we have to allow nature to renew itself and to be an ally in our, essentially our, life or death battle with climate change and biodiversity decline.
That leads us back to hope again, and the hope for our youth. You and I were speaking about the groups that we both have created to educate and empower and support the youth to be our future leaders for the solutions we need in our planet. We've created our group called the Water Emissaries, and we are about to join forces with a high school group called Water Signatories and creating a new entity called the Water Corps, where we're going to be launching this at the United Nations Water Conference in March, which I know that your youth group, Earth Echo, will have a presence as well. Let's talk about the youth's role and how they see the world and the oceans and the systems approach, and how they have hope and give us optimism for our future.
Well, yeah, I appreciate that, and I appreciate the comments I'm seeing here on the side in the chat. Mark, you make, primary ocean is another great example. Kelp is an extraordinary source for fertilizer, animal feed as well. There's a lot of work being done, as I'm sure many of you have heard of, looking at how to reduce methane burps from cows by feeding and livestock by feeding them seaweed. Seaweed's going to save the world, by the way, everybody, if you haven't gleaned that from my enthusiasm in the last few minutes. But my grandfather, I remember again, right here, always looking over my shoulder, literally, figuratively here in the office. He, I remember oftentimes he would talk to me when I was younger, about the importance of education in youth. He was a big believer in that, and he was someone who would often say, before we can talk about conservation, we have to talk about education. And he recognized that without an idea of a strategy to build a constituency in a society that cares enough about these types of issues, that all the other efforts, what I like to call tactical efforts of protecting land or passing laws, will never have the durability that they need politically or economically in order to continue to build lasting change. We see that here in the United States, most famously in our political discourse. I always like to remind people that it was Richard Nixon, couldn't get much more Republican than him, who created the EPA, NOAA, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Marine Mammal Protection Act, NEPA, extraordinary.
Yes.
And it was a bipartisan issue until really the Reagan era, for a multitude of reasons we don't need to go into now. Most famously, of course, when he took solar panels off the roof of the White House that Carter had installed.
Yeah. Terrible.
And the idea that youth has predominantly been underappreciated as a critical pillar or leg of the stool. I think of conservation as a three-legged stool, frankly. I think of it as one stool is your traditional science-based work, which is critical. If you think of another stool as your more direct conservation action, say protecting land, passing laws, legislative action, etc. You need the third leg in order to prop those up and to support those, and that is a society that cares, and that is driven through and by education. No great social movement in human history has been driven by anyone but predominantly young people. And if we don't have a constituency, again, that cares, we continue, as we have for the past 40, 50 years, to fight over things like the Endangered Species Act, to argue about whether climate change is real or not. I remember one such example of this that I was very close to during the Obama administration. I was working with NRDC and several groups to establish the National Marine Monuments off of New York. There are several seamounts off of New York that are vital oases of biodiversity in the ocean. And it was an effort that went on for years and years to get the administration to establish these areas as national marine monuments. Finally, in the waning days of the Obama administration, he signed and proclaimed several new marine monuments around the United States. There was controversy around the pinnacles, the big marine monument off of New York, these large pinnacles, these seamounts, because sport fishermen and other fishing lobbies, understandably, like to fish around them because they're rich air fishing grounds. And in the early days of the Trump administration, with the stroke of a pen, he undid millions of dollars and years of work by de-labeling or decommissioning, you might say, this national marine monument. Fortunately, the wheels of government move slowly, as I know it frustrates many people, but they're intended to. And because he only had one term, he was not able, Biden was able to re-establish that monument. But that is an example of how we live in a political discourse in this country, and have for decades, that has held back long-term and durable progress on these issues. And that's important, durability. We value the wins of legislative wins, these tactical wins along the way, but we haven't built a strategy for how we create a society that cares and votes and buys and invests accordingly. And without that kind of long-term durability, we're never going to solve these problems. We're going to keep going back and forth. And that's really, really important. And one last example of the power of this that I wanted to share. There was a study that Rutgers University released just before the 2020 presidential election. And it talked about the top states where young people have the potential to affect the vote, the presidential vote. And those in the top 5 were Wisconsin, Michigan, Florida, Pennsylvania, states that are swing states that determine, to a large degree, the outcome of this election, of this past election, and likely the next one. And young people turned out at record levels for 2 reasons. One, arguably, the Biden administration made climate change a defining issue for the first time in a political presidential race in history. I'd like to remind people that during the Trump-Clinton debates, there wasn't one single question about climate change in any of the debates. It was a central issue for the Biden administration in this past, along with social justice. And those 2 issues drove a youth vote that made the difference in those swing states and voted for Biden. And so, again, that's a great example of how I tell you, I've been at this for 20 years. When I first started doing youth education work, it was a lonely space out there. And I got virtually laughed out of rooms of big funders and foundations. Oh, that's nice, you do your education work. We're doing the adult work. We're doing the important work. We're going to pass a law. We're going to protect this land. But then I would have people privately come up to me and say, you know, one of the biggest frustrations we have, this is the heads of Conservation International, big organizations. I remember one term that they used, we take land and we put it in the conservation pantry. And the thing that really is frustrating is that then the next politician, the next party comes into power and they take it right back out again. And I said, yes, because we are not building a society that prevents that from happening, that expects this kind of work to be consistent and long-term. And the only way we achieve that goal is with education. I'm pleased to say that now we're having groups like Pew and many of the big organizations, and certainly many of our sponsors and still biggest supporters are companies, if they recognize the power of youth, that are stepping up and recognizing that, hey, we need to, yes, the tactics are important, but we need a strategy to make those tactics durable. So I'm looking forward to collaborating on some of the education work that I know we can do together.
Youth are our future, and they're going to be our leaders who will see the world as the systems and see the connection and really care for Mother Nature like needs to be occurring at this time. Let's shift to a little personal story. I don't know if many people recall, and I fondly recall Steve Irwin, the crocodile hunter, who entertained us a bit like your grandfather did, but in an Australian way, with his adventurous activities and of course his storytelling. And I believe you were with him when he did his last dive and unfortunately left us from that. Can you share any personal story about that?
Yeah, I got to work with Steve. We hosted a show together, and he died basically in my arms at the end of that shoot after being stung by a stingray. He was an extraordinary guy. One of those people that was maybe only 10% less enthusiastic off camera than he was on camera. Steve is one of those people, I think that is once in a lifetime comes along. So I've met some of his family. His son Rob is also extraordinary, as is Bindi. I think that it's one of the challenges we face. And this brings up the way I really look again at this concept of education, which Steve is a big proponent. We had a lot of the plans and ideas that we were hatching on that shoot before that tragedy. He was a terrific guy. He kind of embodied, I think, that generation. I kind of think of conservation in three generations, since my grandfather Jacques Cousteau started and co-invented scuba diving 75 years ago and really opened up the ocean to the world with his documentaries and his films. It was really an era of exploration. When my grandfather set out to do this work, he was about exploring the ocean and all this wonder and mystery. Really wasn't until the 1960s with my father, again, youth, being involved here with a different perspective, that they started to recognize, oh my goodness, like the abundant fish life and grouper and sharks and reefs and things that we used to dive along the coast of southern France in the late 40s, well, during the war actually, in the early 40s and through the 50s, and in the Red Sea while they were filming documentaries like The Silent World. Many of those areas that they returned to afterwards, in the 1960s, had declined terribly. I experienced this myself in the looking at the 1980s in the Florida Keys, and you go back to those same areas like Lou Key now, and you look back and, you can compare. I did a piece about a decade ago with Discovery, looking at the difference between the same exact spot from the 1980s to the 2000s, and it's shocking, the decline. And it was really my father's generation that pushed my grandfather. It's largely forgotten because my father passed away in 1979 in an airplane accident 6 months before I was born. So his contribution is often forgotten, but it was my father who filmed and produced the first 26 episodes of the Mystery World of Jacques Cousteau, and was really the driving force of my grandfather to think about, listen, this is not about exploration anymore. His generation was about conservation and protection. And it was my father's generation that started to really drive that conversation. And you saw Earth Day, and you saw all these elements start to come up, and you saw the emergence of these kind of conservation heroes, which they're still with many of us with us today. Jane Goodall, Sylvia, etc. My uncle. But I think about this generation, my generation, and the ensuing generation now of Gen Z. It's a generation of participation. There's no longer this idea that there are these people out there that will save us. We all need to be a part of this solution. And that is really, from an education perspective, what's exciting, what I find hopeful about this generation of young people. They're rolling up their sleeves and they're getting their hands dirty. And as opposed to the past approach to youth and education, which has been very much what we like to call a hands and feet approach. In other words, like adult, directed, you go clean up a beach, you go do this, really thinking of young people as automatons to go and do our bidding, as opposed to the hearts and minds of the conservation movement, which they are, and giving them the tools to engage in ways that is relevant and interesting to them. Because we know that builds durability of will and builds civically engaged citizens, as opposed to just people doing a job that they're told to do. be that in communications, entrepreneurship, legislation. We have young leaders that we work with that are running for public office. We have young leaders starting businesses. This panoply of opportunity that young people are recognizing, that they can be drivers of this movement. And it's extraordinary. And that is really where I think of, what Steve reminds, just this conversation about Steve reminds me of is, and something he was really passionate about with his kids was education and giving them the tools, is recognizing that kind of our generation needs to pass on this sense of participation to a new generation, that we're all in this together. And as Becky said so eloquently, everything we do matters. Everything we do has an impact.
Yeah, the youth generations have been accused of being so selfish because of the world they've grown up in this world of the phone and digital and social media. Yet they have a value system that is much, much broader than ours. And at our nonprofit group under the Water Foundation that we've set up, the Water Core that we have, what we found is that the youth are our mentors. Mentorship isn't just from the top down. It's not just our elders and our leaders that are mentoring. We are being mentored by our youth, and we have a lot to learn from them because they see this world in a whole new way that we just don't know, and we can't. Our minds can't get around it because we have this old mindset. I wanted to,
it's true. We talk about the selfishness of like these generations. I'm going to close the door. The dog is open. And what could be more selfish than like destroying the planet for our own short-term selfish gain so we can have massive houses, big cars, and all this other nonsense? 50% of the biodiversity is gone in our lifetime. Like my daughter, my 18-month-old waddling around out there, like has no idea like the richness of the world that's been declined. So I think that's far more selfish than a generation that's trying to figure out how to fix that problem. So I would argue that preceding generations are far more selfish in their domination and destruction of the planet.
coming back to